Thank you very much for coming along on such a cold night. I'm very, very pleased that you've come down. What I'm going to do tonight is talk about a sort of a journey from my beginnings to this piece of work here at the Storey. So in a way it's influences, things that are important, things that I like, things that I've seen, things that I've done. There are many, many big omissions in this, and I've got way too many pictures in here. So I'm warning you. There's a lot of very stark images to look at, striking images, I hope. I start off with this picture here, which is me in the garden of the house I grew up in, or the backyard of the house I grew up in Islington in London. I put it here because over the last year I've had to decommission my parents' house and sell it for them. And this meant that I sort of came to see again how important that house was and the life of that house, what happened to it. And so I put this picture in at the beginning as just a sort of, partly because I suddenly realised that it's another world. It's a black and white world. Now we have so much media of incredible quality that we use all the time to document our world. And this was a picture taken in 1965 in the garden in the backyard in Islington. My parents had just bought the house on the right. There'd been a bomb had gone off behind the back wall in the war, so the house was still structurally damaged and showing the marks. It had been heavily repaired, and my dad took on this house as my dad was a builder and carpenter, so he thought he could sort of take on this house and sort it out. But he never quite did. My mum and dad worked in the theatre, so my mum worked mostly with box office, but she also did costume, and my dad worked making sceneries. It's the Mermaid Theatre just next to the Thames in the City of London, and this is where my dad managed to get a job after he'd been working on the building sites. He met my mum, and she got him involved with the theatre. So this was where he managed to get out of the building sites and sort of indulge all his interests, really. But from a young age, I saw lots of things being made from drawings and plans. So I would see little fantasies, then turned into diagrams, and then made real. Though, of course, always made real with a kind of a very thin skin to them. They weren't actually solid, so everything was very portable and lightweight, and a bit sort of fake. But it worked well at a distance. So this also kind of has affected what I do, or I see now that it's done that. One of my favourite films as a child, saw it every single year, The Wizard of Oz. I loved the sort of striking power of the tornado scenes, basically, where everything is spinning around. But then also this way that in the film it changes from a monochrome, or sepia in this case, and then into a world of colour. I found this absolutely amazing. And so I'm sort of very interested between those two worlds, and in a way they can also be, especially also with the first photo of me in the back garden, and now the world where everything is super bright, and we have all this sort of technology to create colour, bright colour. My mum and dad were always pointing out things that they thought were striking, so we would never be able to go anywhere without me and my sister being told to look at things and to sort of notice how strong they were, and try and work out also why. So Wizard of Oz, very, very powerful film to me, and I think later on it appears the yellow brick road appears later on in some of my work. My dad had a workshop, and the workshop was always filled with shavings, wood shavings, and I would sort of play with these things and make things with them. And I sort of see now that maybe this is the beginning of my sort of fascination with the scroll or the streamer, because there were just always thousands of pieces of different kinds of shavings and sawdust in his workshop. Also, my dad was really into, he was into quite good sort of music in the late 60s. This is the Small Faces album, and I remember this, he would play this, it's a kind of psychedelic Storey, which I used to enjoy as a kid. But I also really loved the cover, and the cover is round. It opens up into all of these different sort of pictures of the band and sort of rainbows and things. But so 1967, very kind of at the edge record cover. Also, as a child, I like many kids, I suppose, from the late 60s up to the was really affected by the whole Apollo program. And of course those images are sort of really, you know, we all know these images so well, but they I think for me they're very much still there. I actually try and make this event of the rocket launching, the quality of the sort of brightness, the darkness, the orange flame, the blue sky, was something absolutely amazingly crystal and absolutely sharp and sort of, you know, amazing. But it's all functional technology doing something. So this really, I was really quite obsessed with this as a kid. The clarity of black to white, of monochrome with then colour, the gold, I just found it so amazing. I still find it amazing, all this foil, that you would wrap things up in foil and that everything was quite prismatic, almost like a crystal. So very visually arresting. But of course, we went to the moon to discover the Earth, so the classic image of the Earth taken on that Apollo, I think on that Apollo mission, 1969, which is very much important and crucial to development of the environmental movement. The arrival of the astronauts in New York, again, it's sort of just such an incredible scene with like people basically throwing bureaucracy out of the window, and that's really this sort of amazing sort of idea that celebration is a disarray of bureaucracy, office life, but also, I mean, obviously, as I look at it now as an adult, this kind of strange link to war, to destruction, and that in certain places in the world there are things not too dissimilar that are buildings being shattered and destroyed. And this I think again is another thing that comes back in later work. This is a nice little book that I had. I never read the book because I never read anything because I couldn't read until I was about 11 or 12. So because of that, I was kept a year back at school, and although I don't remember it that well, I know that I knew that I had to be really good at something, so I had to draw, and I had to be good at drawing. But I was very much involved with imagery, with imagery of books, without reading them. So I would sort of, I feel like I kind of entered into them and sort of moved around in them, trying to make up my own stories. But this I just always thought was a fantastic image. My granddad lived in the basement and he collected stamps, so I started collecting stamps, English stamps. And these are very similar to the collection I had. I had lots of he helped me out, so I had lots of Victorian, Edwardian stamps. And what was so interesting was that you had to hold them with tweezers, and with a magnifying glass you had to look at them very carefully. So you had to go into these worlds, and to know whether a stamp was similar to another one, you had to look for defects or whether it had numbers in it. So it was a very, as I realise now, a very interesting way to actually look at images and look at, especially these. I really like these because I like the frames and the sort of colour, the simple colour changes. My dad also had lots of science fiction books and sort of fantasy art, science fiction. So he had a collection of books on his shelf which I would always go to, and because I could look at them and sort of get absorbed into them. This is Roger Dean poster, very famous for the progressive rock album covers such as Yes, bands like that in the early 70s. I always loved this picture. And he also made little models, so I started making models, and I was really interested in these little decals and graphics that went onto the models. And when I look at something like this, I just love the whole thing. It's not about where they go. It's just this sort of amazing piece of colour and graphics in itself. And I used to put little transfers on my plastic animals. So they were kind of mixtures of sort of elephants and rhinos, but a little bit like military vehicles and things. I became very interested in comics, but because I wasn't reading them, I was collecting them for their stylistic differences. So there were artists that I really liked. This is Jack Kirby, who's one of my favourite comic book artists, and he really revolutionised comics in the late 60s, 70s. Made them much more abstract and managed to capture all the kind of movement and dynamism. And I always loved this little setup. So I was sort of interested in all of these patterns and shapes, and I wasn't reading these comics at all, but I had many of them. I had a lot of them. These are two of my favourite all-time covers. This is Jim Steranko. I think this is about 1969. And again, a space theme on the left, and on the right, an interesting, this was the back of the comic, interesting kind of Salvador Dali scene. Again, he was very interesting for pushing the sort of limits of comic book art at that time. Little bits of sort of text cut out and torn and put in. I was taken to I remember going to the Tate Gallery and seeing Lichtenstein's painting, and I remember being really struck that they'd put a comic in an art gallery, and I kind of, and now I can sort of see that was a really important thing to see, because it just said that things can be in different places, that things don't have to stay in one place. And I think that for me is a lot about what art is, or the sort of excitement and freedom of art or making art. This is the first Tintin book that I read, and I read all of them one after the other in as quickly as I could. So I'd finally found something that I really enjoyed reading. I suppose you're probably talking, I was probably about 12, 13 this time. And I also really loved the sort of artwork. It's something really sort of simple and light, and but there's sort of there's drama. It's just I think it's really pleasant, really good. So, and also of course Tintin had red hair and I had red hair, and I could sort of relate to it a little bit on that level as well. So I read all the Tintin books. This is my dad's birthday card to me, which I think he copied from the comic book. So I had my dad to, you know, live up to drawing like that. But I also remember, I think this is around that time in my teenage years, seeing The World at War, BBC documentary. It was about 25 episodes, I think. It was a lot of them. And I remember how kind of startling that was, because I think up until that point, I'd sort of, you know, I'd, like maybe a lot of kids do, one can't really make the link between war and death, and in The World of War, I actually saw a lot of destruction, as well as sort of, you know, dead bodies in it, and there was Auschwitz was in it as well. So I think that was a real sort of kind of, my eyes were open to something, and I could see things in a different way. As in, I suppose I'd been doing the little tanks and aeroplanes and all of that kind of stuff, but that sort of stopped at this point. Very, very great, powerful series. But also, again, I suppose, a reflective of the fact that the war wasn't that far away at that time. I got into skateboarding. This is a contemporary skate park, but I did used to go to skate parks that were not too dissimilar from this in London, most of them covered. And it was just such an amazing place to go, this kind of abstract world where you moved about on the skateboard and experienced gravity, and not that unlike the moon, I thought. So in a way it was like a lunar landscape. But I think this is a really, really beautiful one. I think this is in California. Then I got into punk music or punk. But one of the things that strikes me about this image now, which I always liked at the time, is how much it's like a cartoon character. It's actually like it's a cartoon character, a kind of heroic image, very strong, very graphic, clothes very graphic. So I thought this was really exciting. I wanted to get involved with this. Again, another fantastic kind of clash of images, very strong colours. And now I can see that there's a link, my fondness for this picture, there's a link with those stamps that I collected earlier on. The Queen is in the middle and there's a frame. This is by Jamie Reed, who did all of these punk designs. Well, he did this poster. About '84, I saw the film Koyaanisqatsi, which is a film which takes one on a kind of journey across America, starting off in the caves with cave paintings and ending up with a rocket going up, exploding and coming down. And in between that, we're kind of shown the sort of scale of mineral extraction, industrialization, factories, production of weaponry, gambling, shopping. And this was a very powerful film for me. It's a visual film with music. There's no words, and it's up to interpretation. It's also still from the film of the Stock Exchange, which had a kind of many slow motion layers of film all happening at once. There's this kind of very ghostly scene, and again you can see all of this paper, all of this torn notes and ticker tape and just thrown around. It's a strange kind of mess that they're working in. There's a comic I really loved, Chantal Montelier. She's French, and she writes lots of and draws lots of sort of quite dystopian comic books. I loved this one. Again, you've got like little bits of paper flying about, lots of sort of urban landscapes, and she uses a lot of letraset stuck all over the graphics as well, which I really liked. This is a nightclub that I painted in Soho 20 years ago. So I was quite interested in the kind of electronic music, rave culture at that time. And then what's funny about this is that this is actually the street that I grew up on, because the Greenpeace office opened up round the corner from where my mum and dad lived. I wasn't living there anymore. And I went and volunteered at Greenpeace, and after about a year they started to give me jobs. So they started to pay me to do quite quick responses to projects or actions or campaigns that they were running. And this was against a new road. So these diggers were to go there and kind of symbolically put earth back from where it had been, back into the holes it had been dug out of. But it just makes me laugh, because I used to walk past this spot every day as a kid to school. So it was like I started painting these trucks and vehicles, and they were arriving in the street. This was for a campaign against the reprocessing plant, Thorpe reprocessing plant at Sellafield, which did get built, and I'm not sure what the situation is with it now. But anyway, this was a exhibition vehicle that highlighted the problems of transportation and processing nuclear waste, and so I worked with a company to design this kind of shattered industrial box with these dials, which all have like needles going into the red, but they look like eyes here. But so it's sort of the rivet. I think this is the first time when the rivets start to come in, and I start to sort of go back to making model planes and tanks and things. This was to try and to put pressure on Tesco's, who had the biggest refrigeration systems in the country, that had the biggest CFC systems as well. So they were releasing more ozone-destroying chemicals than anyone else. So we drove this around the supermarkets around the country. There was an example inside of a green refrigeration system, and we parked in the Tesco forecourts, and they let us do it, because they realised that if they tried to stop us, that they would get a lot of publicity. And they brought out a leaflet saying that they were going to sort it out. But once the campaign finished and the money ran out, they didn't. I think they may have done since, but this is 95, so it's a while ago. But people loved it, you know, a lot of people really loved it when they got to the Tesco car park. But again, going back to the punk poster, it's very similar. But I wasn't aware of it at the time, really. But it's the same kind of look and colour. This is the opening shot of Barry Lyndon by Stanley Kubrick, which is my favourite film. I've seen it about 15 times. It's 3 hours long. He tries to recreate the 18th century through looking at paintings. So it has the kind of composition of an 18th century painting running throughout the film, but also there's lots of sort of zooming and can't remember the word where you go back from the character in the image, and so there's lots of bits where you become aware of someone in the world and their scale within the world. I think that's quite a good example of that's Barry and his son in his house, he manages to sort of fake his way up to the top and marry his way into aristocracy. But here he is sitting in a room where he's somehow alienated from the scale of it. He's kind of lost, like a marble rattling around. This is another scene. Now, Stanley Kubrick wanted to film the whole of the film in as much natural light as possible to give it a very realistic look. And to do this, strangely, he had to get lenses from NASA. So the only lenses in the world that would be able to photograph people in candlelight at that time were NASA lenses. And so that's why I put the Earth down there in the bottom corner. But this film also kind of made me realise that I was really interested in history, and I had to take it very seriously. So I thought this whole 18th century, the styling and the kind of and then the idea of science and popular culture, and because I'd grown up in London, the expansion of London as becoming the biggest city in the 18th century. So this is the beginning of a whole new investigation, or my eyes were opened to things from the past, I suppose. And I painted the picture of the Earth for the main stage at Glastonbury Festival for about 4 years. Strangely, when I was lifted up on the cherry picker to put the Earth with someone else on a hooks, a bee dropped down my shirt and stung me. So I thought that was quite sort of nature kind of. This is in a gallery. I tried to make something about a Victorian room which talked about the worlds that fabricated the room or serviced the room. So you've got this landscape of industrialism with a sort of small gap where we're still breathing within it. It says economic growth and collaborate. I like the idea of collaborate, where people's heads were, or a space where people were kind of talking in the room. But this was looking at starting to look at really old decorative languages. I was in a relationship with someone in Switzerland, and I started going to Switzerland a lot, and I love Switzerland. And I love this building and this situation. This is the Santis Mountain. This is a restaurant and a cable car and a transmission station. And when you're right down on the ground, far away, you can hardly see it. So it looks very imposing when you're there. But it's also strangely like a bit of like a mosque on top of a mountain. But absolutely amazing place. Switzerland's at the bottom of that same mountain in those valleys at winter time. The farmers dress up like this and traipse through the snow to give beer to farmers. So it has this strange thing of like extreme high technology and very ancient traditions, all very distinct and separated by valleys. Somehow they've retained all of these kind of distinct ideas, rituals and things. This is another. These are the hats they wear on their head of their farms, which display little scenes. The farmers. This is little scenes of farm life. But I love this mad frame. It's almost like it's not so really important what's in the middle, but just this amazing headdress. Also, I'm really interested in. They have lots of a kind of whole genre of paintings of ski resorts. So again, I really love these paintings. Clarity, but also these little like tube maps drawn all over the top. So you've got this strange mixture of kind of raw power of mountain ranges and these sweet little cable cars and glasses of wine. This is the library in St. Gallen in Switzerland, which really blew me away. This is one of the greatest examples of a rococo library. Rococo being a kind of reaction against the Baroque, so it's a lighter style, a more kind of happy, fun sort of thing. But I like the way that the rococo building is about the architecture dissolving into space. And this is, I mean, I think this is a secular building, but in a religious, this is a religious building where you've got more that the church or the chapel is the way through to heaven, that you enter. That it's not a new idea, but in this case it's interesting in that the architecture literally just the structure starts to break apart and become this painting, which again is illusionistic depth. Also very interesting that the rococo can be seen as referencing all sorts of plants and shells and specimens that were coming from the New World, that people were starting to collect and put into display cabinets. This is in Switzerland. Again, this is kind of an alternative ski slope or mountain range with ski routes on. Again, kind of looking at the service infrastructure that supports architectural space. And it's also I think something about decadence and poverty. That this is a kind of like a very lavish place, but actually it's a poor place, and it's an empty room. There's no furniture. It's like a desert. The floor is a desert, but also it makes me think of the Wizard of Oz. It's somewhere like the Yellow Brick Road.
Sorry, was that the trompe-l'oeil sink?
The sink is real sink.
It is a real sink.
Yeah, but I just kind of gave it an edge to. This is Roberto Matta, a painter, Chilean surrealist painter. I think he painted this in the sort of 60s. It's many meters long and high, and what's interesting is it's like graffiti. He sort of does it ahead of its time. And also I found it really fascinating because he called these inscapes, which are kind of descriptions of the mind and thought. But when I look at them, I start to see them as city environments, as relationships between people or buildings or business or there's magnetic power between things and a sort of interchange. And this was very sort of important, I think, because I started to look at cities. This is a big cityscape picture, like a computer game. But there's a lot of kind of connections and threads that are running through it, which I think were kind of informed by looking at Matta's paintings. So this is the Tower of London and the River Thames running diagonally through the picture, and you've got the old London Bridge, but you've also got Fire, Plague, Blitz. You've got executions on Tower Hill. That's the top sort of rightish corner, that strange circular. That's the gallows. And the new London Assembly, London Bridge Station. And there's a population of little kind of blobs that run around it in a parade. Or they're servicing it or kind of battling. And this was a residency in Northumberland of Alan Head's, with Alan Head's contemporary art. This is on vacuum formed plastic tiles, and it's a picture of the village as a kind of crystal plate, blue and white plate, the sort of thing that you might have in a kind of the cliche of the cottage with the dresser and which I really love these plates. But and under the ground in Alan Heads there's a mine and there's lots of crystals, so it's sort of. It's about that, but it's also, I wanted something to look quite a mixture of high tech and antique, so that was the answer. There's a little bit of a close-up on the next, I think. Just a little close-up of the village green with a little war memorial, people standing around it. And then I found lots and lots of routes within the village that weren't sort of maps or designated routes. They were just tracks and the ways people used it. So the painting is filled with those things that I noticed, and local anecdotes, history, a little bit of local research. And I painted the whole thing in 2 months, flat out, whilst going to the pub to get all my research. So I'd sort of, not that I was drinking all the way through it, but I'd run over and kind of talk to people and then note it down on my map.
So what's the size of the actual piece?
It's
I couldn't tell from the scale of it.
Gosh. It's about 7 or 8 feet wide.
Using acrylics?
It's iridescent metallic acrylic paint, but it's pearlescent. The surface is pearlescent, so this is in a gallery which was in an old bank. So exploring decorative languages and sort of colliding them together, forcing them to stick together. This was an old bank vault's turntable. I think they had money on there, and you could actually spin this thing. I like the idea that the picture moved into the room and then back. I suppose it's a sort of Chinese Gothic rococo thing. There's little jet planes in the middle of the spirals. Very shocking image that we all saw way too many times, and now as well. But one of the things that really struck me when I looked at this was that I just immediately thought of the Apollo launch, and it was like the Apollo launch in reverse, and that the rocket was collapsing down, and then weirdly putting all the kind of ash all over New York, and turning it into a sort of a desolate moonscape. So interested in this kind of idea that, you know, that our civilization has sort of run off the cliff, and we'd be dazzling ourselves to keep ourselves from not actually looking down where we are. This is Coyote from Roadrunner. And so to make sure that we don't look down, we have to sort of the media and technology. The media creates more and more elaborate spectacles and fancy sort of patterns. This kind of was about that. This is in Newcastle at the Globe City Gallery. So this is a kind of chain of there are actually paintings underneath that are all paintings that are significant moments in like the Tower of Babel, and there's Hogarth in there, and that's often the case with making large artworks, is that you get to explore all of these sort of odd corners, and you discover that architecture is really kind of quite wonky. It's not that straight. And also I thought that there's the skateboard ramp as well in here, and I just wished at the time that I could have found a kid who could have got on a skateboard and done some tricks inside it, but I don't think they would have allowed that, because I had to have a rope in the end across the front. I'm not sure, it might be St. Peter's, but a great bit of Baroque architecture, looking up at a sculpture holding a sort of stream of cloth. Very comic book, I thought. It's just like all those comics I was looking at are like Baroque art, really. Not for the same reasons, but There's another comic book character, Bernini, David, about to slay the giant. This is for the Big Chill music festival, and this is corrugated plastic, which I cut out into lots of components, some big, some small pieces, and then on a scaff tower I assembled them by using cable ties. So the plastic runs round the back, and from the back round to the front and then off, and then a cable tie just ties it round its. This is an ash tree. I was very lucky. I found this tree that was very flat, and the foliage was really high. And then we had a light that we bracketed to get it illuminated at night. This was a art trail, so lots of other pieces. This is in a gallery. I think this is a bit of the yellow brick road here, very Americana, a little bit sort of temple-like, industrial, but a little bit kind of like maybe that's the Oval Office, or maybe it's a motorway or a airport, was it airstrip? And then at the back, this kind of barn type of space. This was all done in panels in the studio, and then nailed into the gallery, and then painted. All the edges had to be neatened up. So it was about a month in the studio and a month in the gallery. But I also like the way that the drawing is. It turns back into a sort of flat image. It's that strange thing between the two-dimensional and the three-dimensional. It's the back room. It's sort of something like a barn, or is it a silo? Sort of like, are those kind of, for missiles, or is that a sort of vats of something on the floor? And that's the back wall, kind of globe. It's Stanley Kubrick, that one. This is the International Space Station. I love this picture because it's there's no up or down, and it's the most expensive and most expensive bit of technological kit ever made is sitting up there in space, trying to keep them all alive. I think that's kind of interesting that there's all these systems and kind of life support systems keeping people alive up there in that hostile environment. This was for Tyne Tees Television. There's a bit of a satellite, and they wanted some pictures of local things from TV programs and film. They initially wanted a flat painting, and I managed to persuade them for me to make a sculpture. That's metallic acrylic paint on plastic tiles. This is a school I painted a year or so ago in Bristol, and I got the local the crest, the coat of arms, and kind of cut it into bits and threw it about a bit. Projection on the side of a Georgian house, so it moves the projection, so the little bands of green go up like the progress bar on a computer. So they go up, and then they go through the windows, which are really real windows illuminated, and then out through the chimney. So we kind of process energy and send it back out again. A sort of mechanism, like that was a few years ago. Really love fairground art, and fairground Baroque, in fact. And so I love this waltzer. And then I thought it was kind of interesting because this is from the early 80s in New York. So it's a bit like trying to turn the train into a waltzer, or actually that's a very similar sort of exploration of form and energy, and this was very exciting for me at the time when I saw these first graffiti photographs of graffiti from New York. This is something I did about 2 years ago in Bristol. I became interested in making things that were like landscapes, stratified landscapes. So the band in the middle is my eye height, and then there's this sort of detritus coming spinning out, and the silver dots become like moons and suns, and so that things are starting to, the dots are becoming less rivet-like and more kind of like particles or atoms or sort of cosmic things. Gilray picture from the Regency period, about 1800. Love this picture. This is about a woman who claimed to have discovered something from Titian, a way to paint, and everyone was sort of everyone believed her, and she turned out to be a fraud, but only after selling lots and lots of books on how to paint like Titian. And so these are all the art. This is the whole of the arts establishment at the bottom, sort of, worshipping under her. I just think it's such a crazy image and so sort of modern, that sort of figure on the black, Titian, I think that is. And again, all little bits of paper, and I love the speech bubbles and scrolls. And I'm sort of hoping, I hope one day I'll make something with speech bubbles in. But really inventive, really amazing print. To go back to my parents' house, I had a picture book of London as a kid, and this was in it, and this was, I always fascinated me, and it's a terrace, marching terrace. This is Hampstead Heath on the right, so with these sort of terraces marching and throwing bricks at nature. And our terrace, our house, looked almost exactly the same as this marching terrace. So, and at one time would have been the sort of cutting edge of urban development. This is by Cruickshank, George Cruickshank, who painted it from looking down towards King's Cross Station. This was a commission earlier this year, which I didn't get, but I was shortlisted for a commission in Spitalfields in London, where the Huguenots came in the 18th century and built the fine houses there, and they also brought with them a silk trade or silk weaving skills. So this was my moment to get my interest in Georgian houses out. So it's obviously a mixture of a kind of kiln and a dressmaker's dummy, but also I see it as a kind of warrior, really, as a sort of a worker, with the railings around. And I was hoping that if it had happened, I'd put a little grill at the back so you could put things in, and we might be able to get some smoke out the top. But like maybe herbs or something, burning herbs, or. But also I think it's interesting because it's like I see it, I don't know, as a sort of monument to an industrial past, or to an idea of pollution in a way, even though it is a chimney. It's sort of for me it kind of places it as something that's sort of done, and I was going to get heritage bricklayers to build this. Went to an amazing brick kiln in Essex, which had the only place to still make London stock brick from a seam of clay that runs into London. This was a few months ago in Landguard Fort in Felixstowe. This is a gun emplacement, and right next to the fort is the biggest docks, so for transporter ships. So this is a kind of mixture of a transporter ship and a landscape. It's the landscape in the transporter ship, with the kind of sea horizon with the sun. Lots of people go to this place to look at boats, and the sun going up and down. So it's a strange kind of mixture of sort of global trade and sort of power, and then watching the sort of beautiful natural sunset. So it's kind of ideas about defensive space, and you know, this is coming in or going out, or it's, you know, sort of in the end, trade sits over everything. It sort of dominates, and people ultimately go to war for the right to trade. No, demand to trade. Another sort of landscape kind of picture, and ideas of sort of gases and molecules, but also I kind of like the sort of filmic animated sort of aspect of it. There's a slight motion and repeats, and it rolls the board. It's wood on a frame, hardboard on a frame, and it rolls round just out of view at the side. Again, the sort of levels of space and sort of strata of the ground, and also made me think of as undersides of tanks and things, of sort of relentless machines. This I did this summer, and this is Haggerston Station in Hackney. Edmund Halley was born in Haggerston, and so it's his ideas about the Earth being hollow with another Earth inside it, or two Earths inside it, and the orbit of the comet. This is ceramic tile. One of the drawings for the Storey, and then quite simple in terms of how it turned out. It's a lot more complex. So I wanted to make something that was really kind of uplifting and joyful, and use the structure of the building to set that off. So the kind of the points of the tops of the capitals on the columns, just pick those out and let them kind of like spin off. It was really exciting to do it because of the arches and the way that the colour works against the plasterwork, which I wasn't allowed to paint because of the heritage issues. And then in the last year I've been decommissioning my parents' house. After I'd done this, it was strange because I then thought of the hallway in my parents' house, which is the next slide. That's the 70s wallpaper, and you can still see my dad was really into DIY, but everything started to sort of decay quite a lot by the time I was there sorting it out. But it was a very sort of bright house. The stairs, and it's sort of all been revealed. My father passed away last year, so I've kind of been thinking a lot about what he did to the house. This is my bedroom on the left, and I like the way he'd put these little bits of scrolls. He'd found little bits of wooden details, and he'd put them around the house at different junctions. He built all of these cupboards and all the fitted stuff. But at the same time, this room is downstairs on the right. It was like a stage set. So when you opened a cupboard door, actually the house was still in exactly the same state that it had been when they bought it in '65. But you know, it served us great as a house. It didn't in the end, because they were both very unwell and it wasn't the place to be, and they couldn't get out. It was not easy to get out, but. And the house before, this is my parents' bedroom. So you have to imagine it not quite as torn. We tore this paper away because there were big cracks running from the window, the corners of the windows. But basically, all these bits of carpet came from theatres that they'd worked in the '60s, and my dad loved this picture this post behind the bed. This is the bathroom, and he painted the ceiling black, which I never thought was odd at the time, but now when I realised, because it's a very low ceiling, it's a very low room, but he panelled all of the room. You can just see one of the panels has come off at the back of the bath. They put a lot of energy into sorting it out, but structurally the house was kind of in a bad way, and it was sagging at the front. That was the kitchen that he built. You have to imagine all of these rooms absolutely dripping in stuff, piled up everywhere. It took me a year to sort it all out. And again, with this kitchen, he dropped the ceiling down about a couple of feet. And that was the other end of the room. And if you look carefully at the very top, you can see that he never finished the tongue groove. So you can still see the sort of mouldings on the ceiling of the original room. And so this room was absolutely filled, the books piled up everywhere, and things hanging. You can just see a sort of weight that's on top of the lamp, which had loads of pulleys and clothes pegs to hold it in place. But so this idea of sort of cladding and kind of fitted things, which was very 70s. Oh, and that's the final slide, which I just liked because it was a kind of comic book with a bit of sort of subversive text. So, thank you very much. If you've got any questions.